Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Mobius Moments, where I am live with the one, the only Zander Grashow, and you are the leading voice of adaptive leadership, the leading voice of change. You are a Mobius Senior Expert, which gives me the beautiful opportunity to have a lot of time with you over the past few years, and why I'm so very excited to have even this sliver of time in your life to share you with our community. So thank you so much for being here today. Zander, you're also the co-author of Adaptive Change, and you've spent the last 2 decades taking that model from Harvard and into practice, working with some of the most renowned business leaders, executive teams, change agents, activists, global entrepreneurs. And I think I got the name of your book just wrong, Adaptive Leadership, not Adaptive Change. But to me, when I see you, I think change. So there we go. And that's a big piece of our conversation today. So I'm so excited to be here. Welcome, Zander. Welcome.
Thank you. Honored to be here. To be here with a friend and part of the Mobius community, which I love, and I love the work that's happening in the world. And while I am trying to lead, I'm also leading arm in arm with so many other extraordinary people who are bringing about change, learning how to change. And the only future that we have is one that's more collaborative and more welcoming. So honored to be here.
Yeah. So tell us, Zander, a little bit about how you fell into this work, how you decided or intentionally chose to do this work in change and adaptive leadership. I know you've had the privilege of being part of many, many influential conversations, dialogues, transitions. How did you get to be where you are today?
It's a great question. It makes sense in hindsight, not always as I was living it. But was very lucky to have 2 public servants as parents. And the dinner table conversation is, how does our world work and what's our place in it? And so the combination of that conversation, and then very early on having a number of Forrest Gump experiences of bumping into life and working for Paul Newman's camps for children who were facing chronic illnesses, brought me at 18 into a community that was dedicated to preserving childhood and innocence under hard circumstances. And that led to a series of work in my 20s with the kind of Rockefellers and Synergos, running their community development and change programs in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Southern Africa, and then being really bad at it. And really sort of after the dedication of trying to do game-changing, global-changing community work, really being challenged by what we were able to achieve. And that led me on a quest to try and understand what works, whose work is actually doing the beautiful and consequential work of change, that led me to find adaptive leadership and sneak into a Harvard class to find the adaptive leadership model and begin some of that part of the journey.
Yeah, you are like Forrest Gump. It's like every time I watch that movie, I see a different scene. Every time I ask you about your background, I learn something new. And you're so fascinating. And I think that's what makes you an incredible advisor and mentor today. Just such a robust and diverse background. So for those of us who might be, or I'm not probably included in that group, but for some of those in our community today who are less familiar with what adaptive leadership is or how you bring this work to the world, do you mind sharing a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah. So adaptive leadership kind of came from Harvard with Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky's work, which was built on other elders' work, which continues today in the hands of thousands who are trying to figure out how do we adapt and evolve the way we live and work. When I started doing this work some 20 plus years ago, it took multiple paragraphs to explain that we needed to adapt and change. Now it's quite obvious to many. And I think that adaptive conversation is so ripe for all of us. And to understand that when we go through change, everything does not change. And trying to understand of what exists today, what is the DNA that we actually want to keep and preserve and honor and carry forward? What is the DNA of the way we work that is time to let go of because it is not serving us or unjust or not creating the well-being that we need? And what do we need to create and invent so that we can continue to evolve closer to our values and missions and what we do? So adaptive leadership is a set of tools and practices and frameworks. We're putting language on stuff that humans have done their entire existence, sometimes better and sometimes not as well. But it's more important now, I think, than ever to have those skill sets in our communities, in our families, and in our larger world.
Mm. And are we good at adapting? Are humans good at adapting, Zander?
Oh yeah, we're phenomenal at adapting. Like we adapt all the
Are
time.
we? Tell me more.
It doesn't mean that we're doing it well, right? It
Wow.
means that we can maladapt, right? We can have stimulus come at us and make adaptations that make us smaller or make us more defensive or limit the options of what is happening. We can also adapt optimally and create solutions that have more generative possibilities. But from the moment we're born or, in that process, we are constantly reacting to stimulus and deciding how to make sense of it, even if our sense-making, meaning-making machine hasn't yet grown into its full capacity or sophistication. So we adapt all the time. The question is it maladaptation, optimal adaptation? But we are very adaptive. And that's part of what we've seen constantly. If you look at what happened in the kind of years of COVID, we adapted. Not all of those adaptives keep us in a better place for the future. And so we want to look carefully at how we are adapting. But yes, we are very good at adapting.
All right, so that's a piece of good news. And from all of your work that you've done with humans over the past few decades, do you find that we tend to like change and embrace change, or do we try to resist it and move away from change?
Yeah, I think there's the old adage that is said that we're afraid of change, and it's absolutely not true. We love change when it's guaranteed to be good for us. So we are actually hungry for change that we know will work. So something else is going on. And what people are resistant to is not change, but learning how to give up how they've learned to survive. People are afraid of loss. They're not afraid of change. People are willing to move forward if it's easy and comfortable for them. But when it requires that they give up their routine, their loyalties, their expertise, their comfort, their way of life, they're much more resistant. So I think people are resistant to loss, not change.
So in transparency with our community, I had the absolute privilege of spending a week with you as my teacher at our Next Practice Institute annual gathering. And that was actually one of my biggest takeaways. And in so many ways, and through the work that I've done, it would seem so obvious. But to sometimes hear that it's not change that we're afraid of, but it's the aspect of loss that we're so deeply considering, it really helps. So thank you. Thank you for reinforcing that for me today and maybe introducing something to our group.
That idea is super helpful because it helps generate both strategy and empathy. It helps us understand why someone is walking through the world the way they are and what circumstances has led them to that orientation. And if we start from that place, we have more empathy for them, but also we become more strategic because that invites us to ask the question of what would it take for them to come along versus what is the right thing to do. And when we start with what is the right thing to do, it's often like righteous and conviction. And when we ask, what would it take for them to come along, given their history, given how they've learned to be and survive, our strategies, our language, our kind of dialogues become more rich.
So that's interesting because I was sitting in the perspective of change within, but what you've just shared is how we can make change around us and invite others to change.
Really, yeah, but I think is part of the beauty of Mobius, which is literally what the Mobius strip is about. And at our best, we are in this beautiful dialogue with reality or our business or our teams. That's this inner outer dialogue. The more we understand ourselves, the more we want for the world. The more we understand the world, we understand what we need to do inside of ourselves and what we hope for. There's this constant dialogue between those inner and outer worlds. I know inside of myself at times when that dialogue is rich. I know when then times in myself especially in moments like this when there's such extraordinary violence and trauma that that dialogue is harder and more confusing. And there's other times when I just get stuck and go back to my kind of head down way of working, and that dialogue is less available. And so I think more than ever, we need to figure out how to have that dialogue and not have it alone or with people who look similar to us.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that invitation.
Hmm.
Also at Mobius, we're developing leaders. And I'm wondering, as a teacher, do you believe that leadership can be learned?
Yeah, 100%. And it'd also be hard to raise 3 children without believing that leadership can. But we've seen it over and over again. We've seen it that people's ability to diagnose what's happening around them can become much more sophisticated, to be able to listen to their inner callings and wiring and see that in others, to understand that having a difficult conversation is a skill set. And it's a skill set of using silence and listening and engagement. And so, yeah, it can be learned. There's a set of strategies, practices. But I think I and the people who do this work believe in craft. We believe that it takes skills to do this. The history of people acting from good intentions is quite mixed. But if you think of leadership as a skill set, as a set of strategies that we can go from novice to advanced beginner to expert, yeah, we can get much better at it. And thank God, because the world needs more leadership right now.
Yeah, we need more of you. I know that you offer programmings and master classes for larger audiences, which is wonderful. And also when we think about leadership development or personal development, there's actually an offering that you have that is just so very special. I think it's one of the most beautiful offerings that we can bring to our clients, and it's called the Good Wolf Process. Do you mind just touching on what that is for our audience?
Sure. The Good Wolf Process is named after the First Nation Cherokee community who we worked with, who has a story about a community member who's trying to find their way. Many of us know this story, who turns to the elder and says, I'm trying to find my way, but feel this tension inside. And the elder explains there's 2 wolves, one that stands for love and compassion and creativity, the other that's fear and resentment and insecurity. And this community member knows inside of themselves that they feel both of those fighting, but if they're fighting all the time, they ask, well, which one wins? And the elder shares, well, whichever one you feed. And so on one hand, I believe there are agents and parts of this world that are actively feeding fear. And we are susceptible to fear when we have a future we don't see ourselves in, or when we have complexity challenge us. The easiest thing to do is to go to some old stories. So the Good Wolf Process really came out of desperation, because we were doing these large-scale adaptive leadership work and putting a lot of effort and ourselves into it. And the whole thing would happen or collapse because a few people were the bottlenecks. And so we didn't want people to be the bottleneck to good work happening. So the Good Wolf Process is the intersection of my previous life in economics and fine arts, where it's a very highly structured retreat where someone in the first part of it gets radical clarity of different aspects of who they are. That alone is wonderful. But then with that clarity, we can map it in literally a landscape we create to see the patterns of who they are across these different elements and where they're at their best, where they get in their own way. And then from that information, we can build a decision-making filter so they can make beautiful values-aligned decisions in their life. I believe we're going to face many more crossroads in our own lives about how do we live our values or step away from them. And so it's an extraordinary clarifying process that allows someone to find their own recipe for themselves, for the chapters of their life, and how to make decisions. It's been an honor to bring some 100 people through that and benefit from what they do with that in the world.
Oh, okay, well, this has been one of the fastest 15 minutes of my life. I feel like this is unfair to me and unfair to so many others. So can I ask you live, will you come back on in January or February?
Yeah, happily. Yeah, I love this community. Again, I think I'm trying to practice leadership with other people and through other people. And what I love so much about Mobius is that we need everyone to find their own unique voice in doing the inner and outer work. And so it's always an honor to engage here.
Lovely. And if anybody listening wants to learn more about adaptive leadership, Zander, if you're craving radical clarity in your life and are interested in the Good Wolf, please let me know. I mean, who's not? I'll sign up this year. I'm going through it.
It's great. I
So,
hired someone to put me through it, so I know it's
yeah, I believe that.
yeah.
And Zander, just before I close, what is your hidden job, your hidden talent that has to do with music? What's that
Well, it's
title
not. It's, I'm trying to work for the job. I'm an aspiring
again?
music pharmacist. I'm working
Music
at it. Yeah, I want
pharmacist.
people to bring me what's challenging, and I want to prescribe music for them in that moment to nurture it along. So that's my goal for the long arc of my life. So thank
Music as medicine, as
you.
you
Yeah,
often call it. I love that. And you have playlists that go out every season that I brought to my friends. So
yeah.
we should look out for those. Zander, such a pleasure. Thank you so much for spending 15 minutes on your Friday with all of us. And can't wait to see you again in early 2024.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Family did. I am not the voices in my head. I am not the pieces of the brokenness inside.